My name is Kevin Solberg, and I'm the project manager and digital specialist for the Mapping Prejudice project. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about the historic context of what's happening with race and space in the first half of the 20th century, and then connecting that more specifically to our work with identifying and mapping racial covenants in Minneapolis. So in the late 19th and earliest 20th century, there was a pretty profound national shift in how cities were being conceptualized. And really, for the first time, you start to see things like comprehensive urban renewal programs, planned use commissions, municipal zoning. There are all these different mechanisms that were designed to create better cities. At least that was the idea. However, many of these mechanisms were rooted in a pretty racist assumption, primarily that the racial category of an area determines the quality of that area. Essentially, that white space is fundamentally more desirable, more financially stable than African American space or space that are occupied by other racial groups. So based on this emerging discourse, you see a whole host of new mechanisms that enforce racial segregation that are springing up at the local, the state, and the federal level. The National Association of Real Estate Boards, the Federal Housing Administration, who are responsible for practices known as redlining, homeowner associations, and also racial zoning. One of them, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, or the NAREB, this was the first national organization of realtors. It was founded in 1908, and in 1913 they released a comprehensive ethics guideline. If you were going to be a realtor in the first half of the 20th century, you were professionally obligated to follow this code. And one of the articles, Article 34, stated that a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in that neighborhood. So this is that linkage of race and space, where the quality of an area is being determined now in large part based on the racial category of that area's occupants. And this really institutionalized practices such as steering. You also have what's perhaps the most well-known of these mechanisms, and that's redlining. And redlining was initially institutionalized at the federal level in 1934. The Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, were responsible for creating these redlining maps for American cities. And essentially, the process of redlining was determining which part of a city is good and which part of a city is bad. They actually had 4 different ranks. Green was the most desirable, blue is still desirable, yellow is considered declining, and red is considered hazardous. Redlining is incredibly important because prior to the creation of the FHA in the United States of America, if you wanted to buy a home, you needed primarily cash in hand. There were no such things as 30-year mortgages with a low 3.5% down payment. The FHA starts insuring mortgages in the 30s. This takes a lot of the risk off of local banks and lenders, places it on the federal government. So really, for the first time, through these lending policies pioneered by the FHA, working and middle-class families were able to purchase homes. However, there's a catch. Not all areas were eligible for FHA financing. The image that you're looking at right now, this is a subset of the redlining map for Minneapolis, and this is in South Minneapolis along 4th Street, bordered on the north by 41st and on the south by 45th. And this particular area, D6, was redlined for explicitly racist reasons. On top, this is the narrative description of this area. As the FHA commissioned and created these maps, they gave detailed descriptions of every single category in every single neighborhood, a justification as to why that area received the ranking that it did. And for D6 in Minneapolis, it was redlined because a gradual infiltration of Negroes and Asiatics has occurred on 4th Avenue South. So again, this is that linkage between racial category and the desirability of an area. Briefly, I also want to talk about another mechanism that enforced segregation, namely white homeowners, both informal and formal organizations. In Chicago, you saw things such as block clubs, where neighbors would get together and sign mutually binding legal agreements, where all the signatories agreed that they would never sell their home to anybody who isn't white. And Minneapolis did not have this level of formal organization. What we do see are these more ad hoc committees that spring up whenever white space is threatened. Perhaps the most famous or infamous example of this is what happened to the Lee family in 1931. And Mr. Lee is an African-American man. He a World War I veteran. He worked at the post office in downtown Minneapolis, and in the early 30s moved to a home in South Minneapolis with his family. And within a few days, thousands and thousands of armed white neighbors had surrounded the home and tried to murder the family. The home was vandalized, the family's pets were killed. Nobody in the family was actually murdered, although this is primarily because Mr. Lee called his army buddies in from World War I and they formed an armed perimeter around the home to keep this surging white mob at bay. And as terrible as this was, I think it's important to remember that Minneapolis during this period is actually considered racially progressive. In most cities, and places such as Chicago, when this happened, it often resulted in death. In Chicago specifically, there are dozens of instances where black families moved into white neighborhoods and were summarily executed by their neighbors. So there's a whole host of things that are happening, new policies, new practices, new laws that are springing up all, from the grassroots, local, neighborhood organization level, all the way up to the federal government. And all of these policies, all these practices are attempting to do the same thing, segregate residential space in urban areas. What we're doing with Mapping Prejudice is looking at one very specific slice of this much broader national trend, and that is the racial covenant. And the way that I want to introduce these is simply to read one. So what I have behind me, this is the first covenant we've identified in Minneapolis. It was put into place in 1910. And it reads that the party of the second part hereby agrees that the premises hereby conveyed shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. We've currently mapped over 6,000 of these racial restrictions. The language is highly variable. The racial categories tend to change when you go as you progress through the 20th century. But in every covenant we've identified so far, African Americans are excluded. Covenants in Minneapolis, they began in 1910. That's the earliest one that we've been able to find. Nationally, they actually originated in California in the 1880s as a way to prevent Asian immigrants from purchasing homes in white communities. They were encouraged by the federal government. The FHA, the organization responsible for redlining, in their underwriting manual, and this was the guidelines that the FHA published, making very explicit, why certain neighborhoods are getting the ratings that they are. They actually go so far to say in the underwriting manual that they will not give the highest neighborhood classification rating to any area unless it already contains restrictive covenants. So this is a process that's originating kind of more at a grassroots level, but is being encouraged by the federal government. By the 1930s, at least locally here in Minneapolis, this appears to be standard practice. The majority of homes constructed after 1930 that we've looked at do contain these racial restrictions. And perhaps the most tenacious and insidious part of this mechanism of segregation is how it enforces intergenerational disparities. And this has to do with the legal tool being used. When you add a covenant of any kind, racial or otherwise, into a warranty deed, this restriction tracks with the land and not the individual owner. What this means in practice, if I bought a home in 1910 and attached a racial covenant, 40 years later I sold it to somebody who's white, 40 years after that they sell it to somebody who's white. 20 years after that, they sell it to somebody who isn't white. That person has breached the covenant. They lose the home, any equity they had accumulated, and their property reverts to me, the initial granting party. If at this point I'm dead, it would revert to my heirs or assigns. So once these restrictions get into the property record, they are incredibly difficult to remove. It actually took multiple Supreme Court rulings combined with federal legislation in the late 1960s to finally make covenants illegal. So despite being incredibly powerful and explicitly racist, we actually know remarkably little about the precise extent of covenants. This was true in 1947 when the U.S. News and World Report mentioned that nobody really knows how much land is covered by covenants. Contemporary scholars such as Kevin Fox Gotham and Jeffrey Gonda have said the same thing, that to this day we simply do not know how many covenants are out there. And this has made it incredibly difficult to get at more precision level questions. So questions centered around, well, how many covenants are there? Which parts of a city do they show up in and which parts don't they? How long were they in effect for? How do the location of covenants correlate or connect with redlining maps? How do covenants inform shifting demographic patterns in the first half of the 20th century? How do they connect to disparities in homeownership? As geographers, historians, sociologists, we've never really been able to get at these questions because nobody has ever compiled the data, at least until now. And this is the crux of what we're attempting to do with Mapping Prejudice. We are attempting to build the first ever comprehensive database of racial covenants for a major American city. And we're doing this so we can better understand precisely how racist discourse is being turned to spatial practice in the first half of the 20th century and how this is shaping the built environment. So what I want to show you now is the work that we have done so far. What you're looking at is a time-enabled map that denotes the location of all the racial restrictions we have mapped thus far in Minneapolis. The time slider bar on the bottom left, this shows you the year that we're currently in, and each blue dot on the map itself denotes an individual property parcel that was reserved exclusively for the use of white people. Currently, we've mapped over 6,000 racial covenants in Minneapolis, but we've identified many thousands more. So as much space is racially restricted in this visualization, if anything, is grossly underestimating the total number of racial covenants in Minneapolis. And while this data set is still incomplete, we've already been able to draw some preliminary conclusions. If you zoom in and look at particular neighborhoods, in this case the neighborhood down by Lake Nokomis in South Minneapolis, you can see as the 20th century progresses, the area becomes increasingly covered by these racial restrictions. Indeed, by 1950, it's practically impossible to find a home in this part of the city to live in that does not have a racial covenant attached to it. So many of the blank spaces on this map actually do contain racial covenants. While we've already mapped over 6,000, we have identified thousands and thousands more warranty deeds that we believe contain racial language. Next, we're going to talk about our specific methodologies of how we are constructing this spatial database. And I'll talk more about how we are using tools like optical character recognition to ensure that we build the first comprehensive map of racial restrictions for a major American city.